I'm totally unscheduled, but I'd overheard that things were running fairly quickly, and there was, all these gaps in the schedule. So I was like, "Oh, dude, I'll totally do a quick lightning talk," and James let me. So, that being said, my name's Henri. That's my Twitter handle, Henri Helvetica. That's not my real last name. It's just I thought it was a great nom plume, but I always get the question, and I have to disappoint you and say no. That being said, I'm a freelance developer, and I'm a fan of performance, and I'm going to walk you through the A to Z of web performance. So if you could join me for what I'm calling the Sesame Street Speed Edition. Let's go with A. A is going to stand for async. You can actually, or you want to, async your JavaScript. Some say defer, but you'll be able to also async some image decoding future down the line through Chrome, I believe. B is going to stand for broadly. Again, if you're not using gzip and you're on a secure network, you're probably going to be using some broadly. BR for short, you'll be able to see that into your network panel. C is going to stand for critical rendering path. So who's ever heard of the critical rendering path? If you haven't, I can share my deck. Very important in terms of speed of load, especially the critical resources when you want to get that product onto the page, especially on mobile. Now, D is going to stand for dev tools, developer tools. I'm a big fan of dev tools, even though there are a lot of tools out there that you can use to sort of do some debugging and look at some network resources, but I think dev tools is underappreciated. E is going to stand for EXIF data. Any photographers here? Show of hand, any even like remote? Cool. EXIF data, metadata. 60% of some image data is actually kind of useless for the web. So you want to make sure that you strip some of that out of your images so that when you do load them, they're as small as possible. F is going to stand for first. First as in first paint, first as in first contentful paint. Has anyone ever come across that as well? That's available in Chrome and actually more recently available in Firefox, but nightly right now. This is a way for you to sort of determine how quickly even a speck of paint is coming onto the viewport. First contentful paint, it will be mostly around like images and text, but it's a good metric for you to understand how fast your pages are loading. G is going to stand for Guetzli, another sort of image encoder. I mean, it's part of things like Image Optim if you ever look at the preference panel. H is going to stand for HTTP header fields, aka client hints. This is going to be another way for you guys to kind of serve some resources onto the network depending on network conditions, the page depending on network conditions, little things like that. Still a little experimental, but you'll be able to look that up as well. I stands for Image Optim. I'm a big fan of this application. I would say probably one of the best image optimizers out there. Well maintained by someone by the name of Cornell, who's I would consider an image engineer. J is going to stand for Jank. Jank is something that you get when you don't have some smooth animation. You want 60 frames a second by any means necessary, but anytime you see like a page kind of spaz out, quite often that's some jank happening. K is going to stand for kilobytes. Pages are actually coming kind of heavy. I mean, it's not unusual to find like a 9 or 10 meg page loading up, especially on mobile, and I think that's egregious. So these are things that you'll actually see when you go into DevTools. L, who's ever heard of Lighthouse here? All right, awesome. Lighthouse, auditing tool that's part of Chrome is actually, it does have CLI capabilities, but a fantastic auditing tool that actually started mostly as a PWA tool and then sort of like eventually became more of like an all-around performance auditing tool. So you'll be able to see a number of things like wasteful bytes being loaded. M is for measure. You can't improve what you can't measure. That's without a doubt. And you essentially need to be able to find out how quickly your FCP is, first contentful paint. You need to find out how big your page is. You'll need to find out things like, you get the point. N N is for Network Information API. This is one of actually my favorites. You'll be able to sort of like gauge how the network is that you're using at the point. So RTTs, things like the downlink, things like that. Very, very powerful API that you'll be able to use in Chrome and I think some Blink browsers as well. Always going to stand for offline. I used to think this was absolutely pointless to be able to have like offline capabilities until I start to travel. So you want to make sure that you're able to provide some offline capabilities for people that, hey, in London, subway, Toronto subway, any other areas that where you think you might have some connectivity issues, providing offline capable apps is going to be fantastic. P, prefetch, pre-render, pre-connect. These are all things that we call resource hints. These are, again, and preload to an extent. You'll see that some sites out there will preload things like fonts to make sure that they're ready to go when the request is made. Q is going to stand for quick. Experimental protocol. They're talking about zero RTT, which is very interesting. But some of you may have seen some discussions around HTTP 3 right now, which is actually kind of wild considering 2 is not nailed. But these are things you can look up as well. R simply will stand for request. The only thing I have to say about that is the quickest request made is the quickest request is the one that's never made. Keep that in mind. It's a fact right there. S will stand for service worker. A gentleman earlier spoke about that. You can read up about it. It's a bit of like, how could I put it? Soup du jour. And that was S as well, actually. T stands for throttling. Now, when you're doing some testing, you want to make sure you throttle your network as best as possible. And some say you'll probably want to throttle your CPU. Why? You're trying to recreate the elements out there, and the elements are not a desktop computer with 16 megs of RAM. User timing API, again, when you get into the sort of the entrails of some measurements, this is one that's not oft used, but very, very powerful and important as well. V, I'm going to say V stands for velocity. If anyone used to attend the Velocity conference by O'Reilly, they used to be almost entirely performance-based, but a lot of the documentation and videos are still out there for you guys to watch, so that'll be pretty interesting. W, who's heard of the WebP image format? Yeah? Okay. It's one that's been championed by Google, contentious when it was first introduced in 2010, but now getting a lot more acceptance. Edge added it earlier this year, and more recently, it's behind a flag in Nightly, Firefox, so you'll be able to use it. There to provide as much as 30 to 40% better savings on image sizes than JPEGs. X is going to stand for experience, as in user experience. Everything that we do on the performance side is to improve the user experience by any means necessary again, and which is very important. Y is going to stand for Y slow. In sort of web antiquity, I'll say, Y slow was one of the first apps out there that you could use to sort of like measure performance. It's still out there, actually, if you want to check it out. Z is going to stand for Zofly, another compression library that's being used out there. And to end it in the next two slides, I'm going to say, if anyone's from Toronto and is interested in more performance conversations, I'd run the Toronto Web Performance Group. You can find me on Meetup, on Meetup. And lastly, I'm a bit of a comedian, so I like to end with jokes. So this is, who is this? Wu-Tang Clan? All right, someone knows. So what if Wu-Tang Clan became developers? What would happen? Wu-Tangular. Thank you very much.